Glad to hear you're still out there saving the world, she said, after he made a few comments he regretted now. She knew he'd come out there with the idea that he'd be given the freedom to practice the way he wanted to, which meant more time to talk with his patients. Wanting such a thing seemed almost renegade at this point in his profession, given the dominance of the biological psychiatry they'd been trained in, a regime Anne had never seriously questioned. They'd argued about it plenty, always ending with her calling Frank a romantic, clinging to an old myth about the value of talk. But no words of her could change the fact that Frank had instincts about what it meant to spend time with the people he cared for, and they involved more than picking a drug. He knew his patients sought someone to acknowledge what they were experiencing, and he knew he was good at it, better than most of his colleagues. Well, the book, You're Not a Stranger Here, it came out in 2002. It's 9 short stories. Half of them are set in England, half of them are set in the US. They're all contemporary. I feel my task is to try to describe to people as best I can what it's like to be alive in the world today. So when people ask me what it's about, I would say that it is about characters caught sometimes in extreme circumstances trying to connect or be seen by another person. And so there's a mother who has lost a child who in the last story comes into contact with a boy who she sort of understands to be her own child. There's a father and son in the first story. There's a brother and sister in another. They're all people who are in some way or another love one another but are trying to find the way to express that and communicate it to each other. And it's not easy. And it doesn't always work. It doesn't always succeed. Good, how are you?
Good.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
So, you made it on time.
Yes. So you used to live in this neighborhood, right?
Yeah, I did. I lived here for 2 years, actually. I only moved out a couple of months ago. I just lived a few blocks south of here, this building over here, but this was already kind of a construction zone when I got here. I wasn't actually in the city on the day that it happened, but so it was already sort of a construction zone, and I've watched it over the months become more and more tourists and more people selling things along the streets outside, and and then all the debates about the architecture and what will be built here. So The thing that I sometimes thought about when I was living here and walking by, because I would walk up along here just to go out to dinner or something, is how so much of the news you heard about every day was surrounded these 16 acres. It's like as though sort of the history of the world at the moment was surrounding what happened on these 16 acres, you know. Things for me mostly begin, ideas tend to come from the focus on how a character is perceiving the world around them. So, I mean, just to give a sort of simple example, what might come to me is there's an old woman in a house and she's looking out a window and she sees her neighbor in the yard. And that's the idea that's come to me. It's I guess it's an image. It's an image of a person in a particular place. And then what I would do is describe that as fully as I could. And literally in the describing of it, in the working on the scene of doing that, ideas come in my head. Why is she looking at the neighbor? What is her relationship to her? What is she thinking about? Where does she come from? Is she in the house alone? All these questions come along. And the story really is the sum total of the answers that I give to those questions. Yeah, this is the Trinity Churchyard, and the building I lived in was just the other side of here. And it's interesting, it's the oldest continuous congregation in the United States.
Oh.
Like there's been a congregation on this site since sometime in the 1640s, I think. And the building was built in the 19th century. It burned down twice, and this is the 19th century version of it. And it was actually also one of the, I think still is, one of the wealthiest congregations in the country, because this church owned all of Lower Manhattan. And so at a certain point, obviously over the years, they have sold off the land. In terms of the beyond the practical, it's very much a sort of intuitive, unplanned, uncharted way of working. I mean, I don't have outlines. I don't think of plots in advance. I tend to focus on characters in particular settings, and I write a scene or work with them for a while to sort of figure out what is important or interesting to me about the scene. And from that, I then ask myself questions about why are they there? Why do they need to be there? What are they looking for?
Sort of an odd place in the middle of this.
It is, and I mean, and the New York Stock Exchange is just one block away. I mean, Wall Street's right there, and one of the things about living here over the last 2 years is it just felt like the place that everybody was so focused on the idea of another attack. I mean, the New York Stock Exchange is like barricaded, and there are always policemen with machine guns, and it's just a very, in that sense, tense. But as the thing that's odd to me is that when you read now during the campaign and everything, you read about how Americans have reacted to what happened and their fears about terrorism, and the fact it turns out that there are a lot of people out in the country who are worried about it in small towns in America much more than the people in New York that I know, or that I ever was living a block from the stock exchange. So it's an odd balance between, I guess you just become familiar with it when you're living next to, you have to shut it out a bit, I guess. I mean, you can't get on the subway every time and think, is there going to be an attack of some kind, you know? My parents were good Lutherans. We'd always gone to this big, very plain barn of a church over in Long Pine, whitewashed walls, a simple cross. My mother, when she came to visit me at college, those Gothic stone halls we lived in, she didn't like them, found them suspicious. There was something Catholic about gargoyles on the head of a drain. She didn't like the smell of it. She'd been happy with my father out there, couldn't imagine why a person would want to leave. She gazed past Frank through the window that looked out over the side yard. I'd always pictured heaven as a rather ordinary place where you met the dead and people were more or less comfortable. I think I imagined the whole world that way, as an ordinary place. I think the thing that I look for or that excites me most is when I feel that a writer's managed to get the pathos of their characters and the situations they're writing about down into the sentences, into the level of the grammar of the sentences. So people like Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner were people that managed to take the psychological states of the characters they were writing about and transfer that, not just in setting or scene, but literally in the grammar of the sentences. And so there are, people today that I think do that. I think in his own very subtle way, William Trevor, the short story writer, Irish writer, does that. I think Saul Bellow is someone who does that in Herzog. There are a number of people that influence me. So it's more particular to a book, I think, than one author that repeats that all the time.
So this is the stand?
Yeah, this is my local bookstore, and it's actually a great place to have right here because there's just got everything under the sun in it, and several different floors, and it's an amazing collection. Imagine myself, it's something like scoring music. In other words, you're listening in your head. When I talk to composers, they talk about this, how they hear something in their head, and then that suggests a pattern and something that would follow on from that. So to me, the next sentence has to be written rhythmically in a way that's connected to the previous sentence so that the whole thing has a rhythm as a whole. The last great book I read, I hadn't read Herzog by Saul Bellow.
Okay.
So I don't know, have you ever read any Bellow?
Very little.
Yeah, I had read, what's it called? Seize the Day, which I liked, but I wasn't mad about it. But Herzog is a great book. It's all told from the perspective of one character, and his life's falling apart. I mean, the odd thing is that he's a divorced, middle-aged Jewish guy, leaving his second wife, and I've never felt in the last 5 years, I don't think I felt more identified with a character than this guy, which is the most unlikely scenario. I would say the ratio of what I write to what I keep is very high. I mean, I throw away a lot of stuff. So, I mean, I'd say for the book that I wrote, for every page in the book, there has to have been at least 7 or 8 pages that were thrown away. I mean, all together. But that's just because you go down avenues, you write whole scenes, sometimes half a story or a scene, and you just realize it's just not where the thing has to go. There's something about it. Eventually, one day it becomes clear that you've discovered something, but this has been a transition. It's been a way to get there. I mean, I mentioned William Gaddis is one of the people that I read. Right now I'm reading a bunch of short stories by James Allen McPherson, who was one of my professors out at Iowa, and also Lori Moore.
Love
American.
Lori Moore.
Yeah. So I just finished another collection of hers. I hadn't read her most recent one. This is a good place to wander around and my family is half American, half English. My mother was American, my father was English. And I have an older brother and an older sister. My sister lives here in the city, and my brother lives up in Massachusetts. And 2 aunts that I see a fair amount of, one in the city. And a couple of uncles in England, so it's a transatlantic.
So what do you think sets New York apart from the rest of the U.S.?
I mean, I think in many ways, to me, it feels more like a European city than a lot of other cities in America because of how densely populated it is. I mean, Boston is somewhat like that, but New York's just so much larger. And so in a place like Manhattan or Brooklyn, people are so much closer together physically. I've always had family in New York, though I didn't grow up as a small child here. My aunt lives here, and I've always visited the city ever since I can remember. And somehow knew at a pretty young age that I wanted to move here and live here. And I moved here directly after college. But it's... I can remember first coming to Penn Station and first being met by my aunt when I was a small boy and coming to see theater and tennis and other things in the city. And it's always, in a way, seems like an inevitable place for me to end up. I mean, I think there are a bunch of things that go along with all those things coming together. It just has a more cosmopolitan, international atmosphere than so much of the rest of the country. And I think that's actually one of the things that I thought maybe there was in this feeling of unity after things happened September 11th is that because New York was one of the big targets, that maybe the rest of the country would identify with New York, and because often politicians use New York and San Francisco as these examples that are places that are so out of touch with the rest of America.
Right.
And here was all this sympathy and concern for New Yorkers. I think there is something about the jostle and kind of chaotic atmosphere of New York, and then the homes they live in, the apartments they live in, are often places that are a retreat from that. And I mean, I work in my apartment, in my home, the place that I've attempted to kind of order against, all a lot of the stimulation. So there is some relation between those two.
Make a difference in those family members or citizen members of these immigrants who are earning especially hard these days because many immigrants are feeling the burden who are earning especially hard these days because many immigrants are feeling the burden.
In the left foreground, a tavern overflowed with townspeople, drinkers spilling onto the streets, following in the wake of a large-bellied mandolin player wearing a floppy hat. In front of him, the obese leader of the carnival sat, as if on horseback, astride a massive wine barrel pushed forward by the revelers, his lance a spit of meat. Opposite him in his train, somberly dressed people stood praying in some rough formation behind a gaunt, pale man propped up in a chair, Lent holding out before him a baker's pole. He faced the leader of the carnival band, the two posed in mock battle. Behind these contending forces, the square bustled, fishwives gutting their fish on a wooden block, boys playing at a stick and tethered ball, dancers dancing, merchants selling, children peering from windows, a woman on a ladder scrubbing the walls of a house. There were cripples missing limbs, almsmen begging by the well, a man and woman made love. Another couple dressed in Puritan costume, their backs to the viewer, were led by a fool through the middle of it all. I did start as an actor. I started acting when I was in high school, and in college I did acting. I think being able to enter and spend time outside of your own head in the imagination or minds of other people is both a kind of relief from your own life and a kind of freedom from your own life, because you're entering into another world that is unconstrained. I can't draw, so I couldn't be a painter. Filmmaking takes a lot of people. So there's something about the interior also, about writing, that consciousness. I mean, one of the reasons I like to write is because it's the capturing of people's consciousness, the description of what it's like to live in a human mind, that what compels me. The events in the book didn't happen to me, but the emotional landscape, the sense of characters wanting to reach out to another character. Often the two stories are about two characters trying to communicate with each other. I think is emotionally, very much part of my own experience, and something that I kind of wanted to invite other people into, which is why I called it You Are Not a Stranger Here. I mean, that to me is an invitation to people who might feel that their own experience isn't represented as much. Well, I mean, I'm gay. It's what part of the experience that I'm bringing to the stories. I I don't think of it, again, it was not an effort or attempt to insert it into the stories or the book as much as looking at the variety and range of experiences that for me, I needed to figure out. I mean, one of the things about writing a story, not consciously, I think, but the process is answering questions for yourself. You write about something that is unsolved, is mysterious to you, and the answer comes in the form of something like a story or a novel that gives you a richer answer than a simple than nonfiction or philosophy or another form that doesn't have the ambiguities that fiction does. I mean, I'm looking for a way to put people into the minds and heads of these characters and leave them with those troubles in a way. I am interested in the mind in states of extremity, people pushed to the limits of consciousness. And a lot of these characters, if I had simply set the book 100 years earlier, would simply be considered eccentric people. But because of how psychiatry and the science and the medical world understands the human mind now, we have medical descriptions of it, and so people say it's mental illness and it's depression. And indeed, a lot of these people are being treated by psychiatrists in the book, but that was not a conscious decision. It was really, for me, the question is always how to get deepest into the characters' heads, and one of the results was that I was writing about people who are suffering, and today, often, people suffering, whether or not it should be, ends up labeled mental illness. I was right here on the couch. I heard his door open, and then I heard him crying. It was like years ago when he was a boy and he'd had an upset stomach, and I'd sit with him out there on the porch with his head in my lap as the sun went down, and I'd tell him how one day we'd take a trip on a boat all the way across the Atlantic, and he'd see Athens and Rome and all the places where the stories I'd read him took place. And he'd fall asleep listening to me. When I heard him cry that day, I thought maybe it was all over, that he'd come back to me somehow. He hadn't cried in so long. I went up the stairs. My son, he was naked. He'd been rubbing himself. For hours it must have been. He'd rubbed himself raw. He was bleeding down there. And he was crying, his tears catching in a little beard that had started growing on his cheeks. The soft little brown hairs he hadn't learned to shave yet. When I got to the top of the stairs, he looked at me like I'd severed a rope he'd been clinging to for dear life, just like that, like I'd sent him down somewhere to die. What could I do? I got a towel from the bathroom, a white towel. I got gauze and ointment, and I sat him down on his bed, and I cleaned him and put Band-Aids on him, and I tried not to weep. Why do I write? Unfortunately, that's a good question. It's very difficult to know sometimes. It's the most mercurial profession I think I haven't practiced many, but it's so up and down. I mean, the days that go well, I would say I write because it's the most satisfying thing in the world to capture in a sentence something that was not quite fixed in my mind, and yet at the end of the day, I've captured it in a well-crafted sentence. On the bad days, I wonder whether I still should. And I honestly I'm skeptical of the idea of being a professional writer, to be honest. I mean, I have a suspicion of the professionalization of writing, though that's at the moment what I am. So.
You have a lot of characters that are sort of hard adolescents. Do you base that on yours? Like, did you have a hard time, or are there experiences that are yours, or is it?
I mean, some of the settings are actually some of the adolescent the scenes that I write about are probably some of those are probably more autobiographical than some of the other stuff in the book. But I mean, I grew up in the suburbs basically, and I mean, I came back and forth to New York a lot and into Boston, so I sort of had. But a lot of the scenes I was writing about were about the particular life of kids in the suburbs, which I think has a at this point a kind of long literature behind it, going back to John O'Hara and Richard Yates, and there are a bunch of people who've really kind of covered that. John Cheever wrote about the New York suburbs a great deal. So that's all, I guess, stuff in some sense in the background for me when I'm thinking about writing those kinds of scenes. But the task is always to try to find something that's got a newness to it. I don't think that the writing's changed the way I view the world as much as because of the way I view the world I write. I mean, I think you, as a writer, you're always experiencing things as potential stories almost at the same time as you experience them as reality. So, I mean, I often, it's like this double vision in which, on the one hand, I'm experiencing something, on the other hand, I'm thinking, where would that fit in, or how does this, how would this make sense in a story or a narrative? And I think in a way it's a form of control. I mean, at one of my stories, The Good Doctor, I compare the psychiatrist to the relationship between a psychiatrist and a patient is between that and a writer and a character. I mean, there's a way in which it's a certain kind of distance and a shaping of experience that you do when you make a story out of somebody's life. It was a collection of short stories. It was my first book. I definitely imagined it was going to be a kind of, I'd give a few readings and there'd be a couple of reviews and that would be that. But it turned into a much larger thing that I couldn't have really anticipated or expected. And it happened sort of slowly. I mean, there were, I was on TV doing some interviews and then it got some good reviews and it just began to sort of build. And so it really ended up kind of changing my life more than I imagined it would when I first came out. If I experienced actively the pain of the character that I'm writing about, if I experienced it too actively, I wouldn't be able to write about it. You've got to have some. I think having to give stories shapes and having to be responsible to your reader to create a world for them keeps you from just entering into a kind of diary-like relationship with the pain or suffering that the character's going through that you're going through, So I feel a real responsibility to the reader, and that's the kind of discipline and the structure into which the emotions get poured, hopefully. But yeah, there are times when, you know, you realize you're focusing on something that's pretty sad, and you sort of step back from what you've written, and it strikes you that that's what you've been thinking and, you know, dwelling on for a long period of time.
The sky was empty. With all its meaning. So I said goodbye. Took the pen. So I hung out in the woods. And the tree branches swallowed me up.
It was actually fun and enjoyable to be in New York during that period. It's sort of the place where a lot of that was going on and happening, and so it seemed like a fun place to be while that was going on. And I imagine I will stay here. I mean, this sort of seems like the inevitable place for me to live at this point for any number of reasons. So.
Do you want to get something?
Yeah, sure. We could, find a drink here or something. There is something about trying to keep your world ordered when inside things, in order to get at the things inside that are tumultuous, that I want to get onto the page, that are often difficult when I'm empathizing with characters that are in a state of pain. In order to do that, a lot of the rest of your world has to be, at least for me, ordered and routine. I mean, I'm happiest when I'm in a very routine, kind of low stimulus environment, when I do the same thing day after day, and when the world around me is fairly ordered and secure and put together, so that when I sit down in front of the desk and begin to imagine characters in extreme states, somehow it doesn't bleed out in the rest of the world, of my world, because otherwise there would just be too much uncertainty, I guess. It's a way of balancing. At medical school, they all joked about the numbing. From 4 months spent dissecting the body of a dead man, cutting into his face and eyes, to 7 hours clamping open a woman's chest, only to watch her expire on the table. Whatever the particulars, it didn't take most people long. And then in residency, schizophrenics trembling in psychosis, addicts, manics, beaten children. Frank joked too. But he always felt odd doing it, as if it were a show to prove he was adapting like his peers. The fact was, he still felt like a sponge, absorbing the pain of the people he listened to. Privately, he considered the act a certain kind of faith. Never having been a religious person, empathy had taken up the place in him belief might have in others.